important to recognise that Liberals do not have ideology. I mean, the left want to tell us we do, but in the end they're the ones with the ideology. Ideology is, you know, the utopian vision, the perfect Australia that we're heading towards if we just follow this plan that they've got. We don't do that. We just look for practical solutions to practical problems based on strong principles.
Afternoon, welcome to Sunday Sessions. My name is Andrew Kremen and I'm joined by my co-host Rory O'Connor.
Hey, how's it going?
Good, I'm good to see you. Should the Liberal Party be reformed, both at state and federal levels? We're seeing very different styles of governance. Are they aligned with the party's original vision? Here to talk about this is Nick Cater, the Executive Director of the Menzies Research Centre and former Deputy Editor of the Sunday Telegraph in Sydney. Nick, welcome to Sunday Sessions.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Rory.
Good to have you on. As always, you can ask your questions to Nick in the comments section and we'll try and get to as many of them as we can. Now, you recently wrote the essay, When the War is Over, published in Australia tomorrow. Could you talk to us about this essay?
Yeah, well, I was asked by Jake Thrupp, who edited the book, to think about, you know, the great challenge for the Liberal Party at this point in time, which is obviously, you know, very much influenced by what we've been through with COVID. And I thought long and hard about it and went back in the end to Robert Menzies, to the speech he gave on 22nd of May 1942, which is, you know, students of history, you'll know, was a very, very difficult time in Australia's history. We were in the middle of World War II. Not only that, we were at the most crucial part of World War II. The Japanese, you know, were close to breaking through to be able to reach the Australian mainland. You know, we were holding them back with the Americans. There was a Battle of the Coral Sea around that time. Only 6 weeks earlier, Darwin had been bombed with the loss of, I think from memory, more than 200 lives. And 10 days after Menzies gave that speech, there would be submarines just outside where I am here in Sydney Harbour, Japanese submarines firing live shells at Australian destroyers. So it was a very, very crucial moment in the war. But the interesting thing about that fantastic radio talk that Menzies gave, it was broadcast live on 4 stations around the country. The amazing thing about that talk was he barely mentioned the war. He was looking forward to what was going to happen afterwards. He was thinking about, you know, he had faith that we would win the war through courage and through bravery and with the support of our allies, as indeed we did. But the important thing was what would happen afterwards. And I think we're in that moment now more than any other, certainly in my lifetime. I think more than any other point since World War II, we're at a defining moment. And I think that the Australia we will emerge from, and the culture will be irrevocably changed by what we've gone on now. And so essentially we're there to do what Menzies was there to do, which is to defend the right of the individual against the all-powerful state. You know, for him the threat was from totalitarianism. He was thinking fascism, communism, which are essentially 2 branches of the same thing. But look, you know, the challenges today are not so very different. We've got communist China for one, but also internally it's the damage we're doing to ourselves, to our own freedom, which it's most alarming for me at this moment, and it's the thing we really need to focus on fixing and on overcoming once we emerge fully from COVID.
What was the catalyst that first inspired you to join the Liberal Party?
Guilt. Well, let's go back a bit. I mean, I was a journalist for 25 years, and I mean, I always felt that it wasn't, you know, a journalist should not be a member of a political party. I mean, other journalists take different views, but it seemed to me you know, you had a duty to be independent, to report things without any partisan bias. So I hadn't joined the Liberal Party since I came to Australia. But when I first came, I might have been more inclined to join Labor, to be honest, but that didn't last very long. I think, so then I became Executive Director of the Menzies Research Centre in 2014, and a little bit after that I realised that I should join the party because the Menzies Research Centre is affiliated with the party. I mean, I should have joined obviously when I got the job, and I neglected to, but I am I've been a member now for about 5 years. Not an active member because, again, I think in my position at Menzies Research Centre, it's not helpful to get involved in factional or branch politics or anything, because we're there to support and represent the ideas of the whole of the party. But I do think party membership's important, and for reasons we might outline later in this discussion, I think it's really, it's terrific that you guys have that commitment at your stage in life, and more should, because frustrating as it can be, the Liberal Party, and we all face those frustrations, without it, there is no chance whatsoever that the centre-right would be in power in Australia. And if you're not in power, well, what's the point, really? You have to be there to have a go. Even if Liberal governments are imperfect, as they by definition are, because they're only run by humans, it's better than the opposition. We have to keep remembering and tell ourselves time and time again that our worst is better than their best.
Why do you think the party needs reform?
Reform's a big word. I think, look, there's some structural problems in the party, and again, I don't get too involved in this because I don't get involved in the party at that level, but just looking, I suppose, almost as somebody outside that process as I can afford to be, I think there's an enormous problem with the factions, that they're kind of sucking the they're sucking the values out of the party bit by bit. It's a slow process. It doesn't happen overnight, but the more people become focused on, who I have to impress, or who I have to, be close to in order to get pre-selection, instead of what values should I represent and stand for in order to be true to the Liberal calling, then eventually, you start to get this position we're at now, which is where I think so many MPs and members just don't, it's not always clear to me what they stand for, and what they stand for can often shift, and that's not liberalism as I understand it. I think it has to be, people want people of, leaders of conviction, and Dominic Perrottet is the shining example now of a conviction politician, and how refreshing is that? I dare say not everybody on this call would agree with him on abortion necessarily, or euthanasia. I happen to, but I know that that's an issue with which Liberals can disagree. But you've got to admire his the fact that he stands for something. He stands for something other than just keeping himself in a job.
Absolutely. And I suppose my next question, this ties into it. Why do you think the Liberal Party has been so successful?
Well, that's an interesting question, isn't it? I think I might have come close to answering that in the essay. It has been very successful. Like, we've been in power now. I did the maths on an Excel spreadsheet and I've lost it, but I think we're now past the point where we've been in power 2/3 of the time since the party was formed back in 1944. I might be wrong about that, but it's something around that, right? For every year that Labor has been in power federally, states a different matter and it's a bit more confusing, but every year Labor's been in power federally since 44, certainly since 49, sorry, when we first came to power, we've been in power for 2 years. Now that is an incredible record, and if you compare it to conservative or centre-right parties across the English-speaking world, it's by far the best. The next is Britain, I seem to recall from the work I'd done on this, and then I think New Zealand and United States, if you count the fact Republican presidents versus Democrat presidents, not the same thing, but it gives you a rough indication. And in Canada, the Conservatives in Canada have been in power for less than half the time. So there has to be an answer to that. And I think it's partly in the nature of the country. We've always had a strong middle class, and we're a party for the middle class. But I also think it's Robert Menzies, because Robert Menzies was such a clear thinker. He articulated what it meant to be a Liberal more clearly than anybody else, and he gave us that that firm direction and purpose, which is lacking even in the British Conservative Party, I have to say. I mean, Boris Johnson sometimes sounds very much like a liberal, but it's never articulated that way. You know, conservatism in Britain is a much more confused intellectual force, I think, although they've had some terrific moments with leaders like Churchill and Thatcher.
You mentioned that that the Forgotten People radio talks of 1942 were an unparalleled feat of intellectual leadership in Australian public life. You mentioned that in your essay. Can you imagine something like this happening again?
Well, number one, I don't think people have quite got the attention span, either the speakers or the listeners. I mean, that book, I think I've got one here if I can see it. No, I can't, but we published it. 35 radio talks that Menzies gave. Each one lasted 45 minutes or thereabouts. So it's a lot of content that he gave. And each one of those you read today and is fresh as the day he wrote it. So that is an incredible contribution in itself, really, that body of work. But it was all focused on one thing, and that was, 42, he just lost power as Prime Minister for the United Australia Party, which is a very, just not a strong political force. And the centre-right was hopelessly divided. And Menzies thought, well, we've got to bring them all together under one banner. And so he went back to the heart of classical liberalism, which is the individual, the importance of the individual, and the state not trying to run the place, but letting individuals, through their own ambitions, generate the energy that would develop a good and prosperous society. So it's a very simple idea in one sense, but he just focused on that relentlessly, the idea of freedom, and brought the 28 factions together. Different parties of all sorts from all over the country came together in Albury in December 1944 to found the party. And that's an incredible feat, but he did it around an idea. So ideas matter, and it's just doesn't happen often enough. The politicians sit and give speeches about ideas. I mean, John Howard said to me once that I was saying to him how remarkable Menzies' body of work was, his speeches, and there's thousands of them through his career, but those 35 are the real nub of it. The politicians don't, speeches today that a politician gives probably won't mean anything in a few years' time. And Howard said, well, that's because Menzies never actually talked about the policies of the moment. He was always talking about the principles and the values that lay behind it, and only incidentally on the political challenges of that moment. So, but I'd like to see politicians do more of that. And back to Dominic Perrottet, he gave, I think, 3 landmark speeches with us, with the Menzies Research Centre, over the last 5 years, because he was thinking, well, if I'm going to be in a position of leadership, I actually have to know what I stand for, and he used those speeches to really work out his understanding of how liberalism applies today in New South Wales.
Then part of the reason would be politicians, or perhaps people in general, are lacking the initiative to embark on such a project.
Yeah, it's also a reflection, I suppose. I don't want to give them excuses, because I think all of them should be thinking this way. Some do. I mean, people like Alan Tudge, for instance, Angus Taylor. I mean, they're very thoughtful people who actually pull their thoughts together. So I don't mean to pick out just those two. There's plenty of others in the senior ranks of government. But if I'm going to give them a little bit of a break, then I do think it's very difficult in the era of the 24/7 media. Menzies could sit, tuck himself away for half a day or a day and concentrate on his speech. There's not much room for that now in politics, with everything that's going on around you and Twitter and the constant demand for media grabs. So I think it is harder in that sense, but I think I really would encourage politicians, or even people like yourselves, starting out your political journey, really to take time to think, so important.
Absolutely. And speaking on that, we do have an audience question. It says, with the Liberals now running on a net zero platform, would pushing nuclear be the best option? And if so, why can't we do it now, besides ensuring that there's a bipartisan consensus to do so?
Yeah, well, that's a very good question. And the answer is, I think it goes to the history of this issue, which has been, in the past, has been a very fraught one. Nuclear didn't have the support of 50% of the population, and was the subject basically of a scare campaign by the left, by Labour in particular. I traced this in a column I wrote recently. They really just, every opportunity they had to be grown up about it, they'd choose to do a scare campaign. And let's face it, in the past it was very easy to scare people about nuclear, because we had a nuclear weapons standoff, we had things like Chernobyl happening and so forth. So it was easy to create that campaign. And the last government Howard had a half an attempt at going to the 2007 election with a sort of open mind about nuclear. And Albanese, interestingly, was in the I think he was the energy spokesman for Labour under Kevin Rudd in 2007. He ran a deliberate, cynical attempt to sabotage nuclear, because he's asking, do you want this in your electorate? So Labour has done that and has been they've been able to basically put a block on any nuclear debate, because no Liberal government's going to risk losing an election over it. I mean, there's some things you die in a ditch over, but not that. So, but things have changed dramatically. All the polling that I've seen show this, that there is a broad acceptance of nuclear, that you could, even across the parties, except perhaps the Greens, you could get majority support. And 80% support within the Liberals, 83 I think of the last polling I saw with the Nationals. So why won't they do it? Well, I think it's just an abundance of caution right now. It's not, the federal government is not interested in picking, fights that it doesn't have to fight right now, and I don't think it has to fight this one right now. The crucial thing is they've made a decision on nuclear submarines, so that means that we will be already from now be increasing our nuclear expertise and capability, which is one of the big hurdles to getting it. It's actually having people studying it at universities and understanding how it works and understanding the safety requirements and so forth. That's happening, or will be happening, pretty quickly because of the nuclear submarine commitment. So we can come back and revisit this in calmer waters, but and it's also the cost factor. I mean, like all these things, in the end, it's, yes, we can do it, but what will the cost be? I mean, I happen to think that the new fourth generation small scale reactors will be very effective and cheap in our situation, because they save on a lot of transmission costs and various things. So, but that's got to be worked through. So I'm happy to say that's a debate that we'll put off until after the next election.
In regards to a reform plan, be it of the party or just the vision of the country in general, are there various branches or think tanks that could potentially lay one out? I mean, you have written an essay for a book.
Well, the idea of a big reform for the party is sort of difficult because of the way the party was structured. It was structured from individual, independent divisions in different states. It was set up to be a grassroots party, and that's why we like it. It's probably not nearly grassroots enough, to be honest, but for the membership at local level to feed ideas up through the party and so forth. So it's very hard to impose a top-down solution. I mean, we were involved in some work on gender, trying to get a gender balance in the Liberal Party, and I thought we came up with some pretty good proposals, but implementing them is very difficult. You can put them to federal executive, meets in Canberra or Federal Secretariat, Federal Council, and they will, they can say yes, a nice idea, but they don't have the power to tell each of the branches you've got to, put these measures into action, even though they were quite modest measures but effective measures. So I don't know that we can be reformed that way, but that's probably, in the end, that's probably good for the party. It means that it's frustrating sometimes that you can't implement change rapidly, but then you don't want the wrong people making poor judgments and making poor reforms. So I'm kind of content with the Liberal way of reforming, which is sort of bit by bit and patiently, and so we had some, I think, reforms in New South Wales Party on making it more democratic. I think that they're already paying off. So that's how you do it. But in the end, I mean, the crucial thing is just to get members, and the lack of members, the lack of commitment for people to join the party, and the feeling that because it's not the party they're not the perfect party they imagine, they're not going to have a bar of it, instead of thinking, well, I'll join and I'll work patiently to implement change and push it in the right direction by going to branch meetings, by getting elected so that I can go to Federal Council and argue there and etc. That's the way it should happen. But too many people are just throwing in the towel and saying, oh, bugger it, I'm going to join the LDP or whatever, LMP, whatever they call themselves. Well, LDP, isn't it? Liberal Democratic Party.
Liberal Democrat Party.
Yeah. It's just another failed experiment, in my view.
Well, I mean, it's something that's quite funny to me, because I've heard some of the things you're describing. Some people say, oh, well, the party's perhaps too left-wing, too right-wing, too conservative, not conservative enough. But I've heard suggestions, of starting a completely new party, but that would be so much more difficult than if you actually joined the party and wanted to participate in reform. We do have another question here. Sorry, did you want to add to that?
Well, I'd just say that it's been tried many times, going back probably to the 1970s, and it's never worked. Every time it's ended up petering out. So I don't see, I admire the enthusiasm of some of the people that have left to join the LDP, but it's a triumph for hope above experience. I actually think they're going to make any difference, to be honest.
And why do you think that is? And I suppose, do you have any comments on Cory Bennardi and starting the Conservative Party as well?
Well, I wonder. I don't know. If I had a quiet moment with Cory, I'd probably ask him, does he think it was worthwhile? I mean, it was an abject failure, wasn't it? They just, and it was a shame, because there were some really good people who joined the cause with the right motives, and I think it's a mistake that we've made it so difficult for them to rejoin the Liberal Party. But it just didn't work. It didn't work. There's no appetite for that. Most people in Australia, you've got to appeal to the middle 60%, right? So on any given issue, and almost any given issue, I bet you can probably divide the country up into 20%, 60%, and 20%. So the 20% at the top are the mad, green fruitcakes, and the 20% at the other end are largely decent people, people like Craig Kelly. But the Australian public's somewhere in the middle. That they are conservative, more conservative than we imagine, but they don't want ideology. They want a pragmatic party that can just get into power and get things done. And look, Craig Kelly and Clark Palmer United's not going to do that, is he? I mean, it's already so that's where we have to be, I think. And it's about I've just been written a column tomorrow talking about Thomas Sowell, the American economist, who said very famous phrase, but I've gone into it a bit in regards to climate change. There are no solutions, only trade-offs, and that's the reality of political life, right? There's no perfect solution as we imagine it to anything. Everything is a trade-off between various people. So if our position I don't imagine that there's a single MP or senator who came out of the party room last week saying, oh, that's the perfect plan for zero 2050. But I would imagine that there'll be a lot of them that would have come out and said, well, it's a pretty good, probably the best trade-off we could get between, the people that Dave Sharma has to cajole into voting for him in Wentworth and the people that Scotty Buckholtz has to cajole for him to vote for him out in, the Warrego Highway. So that's the reality of a party. If you want to be in power, if you want to be successful, it has to be a question of trade-offs, and we have to be prepared to accept that pragmatism. And often it comes out to a better position, becoming something closer to the national interest. We don't want the national interest to be decided by people in the pub in Gatton. We don't want it to be decided by people in the coffee shops in Double Bay. There's a national interest that's something separate from that, and that's why come back to your question: why is a party being so successful? Because we've been successful in trade-offs, basically, not purity, but trade-offs.
Absolutely. And just before you continue, Andrew, that was actually one of our audience questions here. I'll just read it out. It says, do you think the Liberal Party's success in Australia compared to other centre-right parties around the world can be attributed to the fact that the Liberal Party has been seen to be based on a more pragmatic conservatism compared to pure ideological conservatism? I think you pretty much answered that.
Yeah, I think so. I can go on about it, but yeah, we're not ideology. It's important to recognise that Liberals do not have ideology. I mean, the left want to tell us we do, but in the end, they're the ones with the ideology. Ideology is, the utopian vision, the perfect Australia that we're heading towards. If we just follow this plan that they've got, we don't do that. We just look for practical solutions to practical problems based on strong principles, and that's how we tackle everything. And it's in that context that we've got to look at the 2050 solution, which, believe me, it doesn't bring joy to my heart, but I'm prepared to get behind it because I think it's the best pragmatic solution to avoiding a Labor government.
Many of us are aware of various neo-Marxist threats in our social fabric, and I would argue that some of these ideas have been unwittingly supported by certain members of the Liberal Party. In what way are they similar to Menzies' concerns of socialism?
Well, I think the big example for me is COVID, right, and the way we've handled that. I'm very encouraged to see there is a difference between the way the New South Wales government has handled it and the way the Victorian government's handled it. Not as big a difference as I might have liked. I suspect not as big a difference as Dom Perrottet would have liked. But you can see that this is crucial. So if you think about it, how do you tackle something like a pandemic? Well, you can say, we're going to focus on the health of the entire society. So that means everybody has to be protected and locked down, no matter what age, because there's always a small risk they may get this thing. We're going to have to give everybody the vaccine and then give it to them again because it didn't work the first time. And if you don't take the vaccine, then you are endangering your fellow citizens. That's a mindset that produces that way of dealing with it, as opposed to the other way, which I think is more of a liberal way, which says, well, there's a dangerous virus out there. You as an individual have got to do everything you can to protect yourself. We as a society or as a government, as a community, will help the people that find it difficult to protect themselves, the old and the vulnerable, and in this case, they're in most danger. We're going to look after those people in nursing homes like our lives depending on it, etc. Anybody who's got a possible comorbidity, they should see their doctor, and we're going to look after those people. But everybody else, this thing is nasty. You don't want to catch it. We're going to get the vaccine out there as quickly as possible. But I tell you what, once the vaccine is out, we're going to open up the economy, and it's your lookout if you don't have it. So not this sort of 70 or 80% threshold. So that you just throw this in a liberal way. You make this a matter of individuals looking after themselves and their own interests and throwing the responsibility back on them. And I think that would have been a far better approach. But there's very few governments in the world that have done anything close to that. So it's almost like a kind of collective madness that we've been caught in. So I'm not kind of I don't blame particularly any government here. It's just the way they've gone and the way they've followed their health officials. So that's an example of how we get caught up with a socialist way of thinking, a way that thinks about what matters is the health of the whole society, not the individual. Whereas we've seen the rights of individuals and the dignity of individuals just trampled in the cause of this pandemic, and I think it's just been a horrible thing to be part of.
I don't have any information on me, but I was watching a news piece today mentioning that Pfizer, in their contracts with various countries, essentially, coercing them in various ways. They cannot talk about the contract. They have to defend Pfizer in court if they get accused of intellectual property. If something goes wrong with the vaccine, like there are a number of ways in which they can hold the country to account. And furthermore, even if they sign a contract, Pfizer is the one who decides whether that country gets the vaccine and how much of the vaccine they get. So is part of the reason why some of this more totalitarian sort of style governance we've sometimes seen from the left and the right has been as a result of those contracts.
I'd see this as the influence of vested interests, and vested interests have come into play. Governments have to be very strong to resist it, and that's plainly the vaccine countries. I mean, but good on them. They've done a remarkable job in getting reasonable vaccines, as far as we know, out fairly quickly. But of course they're going to use vested interests. So I kind of shudder when people talk about we've got to vaccinate everybody from the age of 6 months upwards. In whose interest is that? The chances of anybody under 25, under 35 for that matter, becoming seriously sick and dying of this virus is statistically insignificant. So in whose interest is it? It's only in the interest of the vaccine companies. And we know we've engaged in this behaviour before over things like statins for, which none of you guys probably aware of it, but people of my age who, sooner or later the doctor will want to put you on statins because they're supposed to lower cholesterol. But actually the medical science behind that says, well, a few individuals who have particularly bad cholesterol issues should be on it, but not everybody. But that's been going on for a number of years. So yeah, I'm sure that's right. But it's I suppose Menzies would, if you go back to Menzies, he'd think about this as vested interests and the importance of government being independent and being aware of vested interests and not just jumping and acting for their cause. So I think in this case, we probably, because we've been so beholden to them, or so we thought, we've done a whole lot of things you could talk about that have gone on that I think the influence of the pharmaceutical companies have brought a great deal to bear, and not always to the benefit of the consumers. In fact, almost always not, because in the end, the thing that benefits consumers is free and open competition. And if you get, a few big companies that dominate and are able to bring undue influence to bear, that won't be in the interest of consumers. You can guarantee that.
We have another audience question here, and it touches on that a lot of people that talk about reform, they say that the Liberal Party is quite often copying a lot of Labour's policies, so they feel that the party is going too far to the left. So this question continues and says, do you believe that the future of the Liberal Party is centrism?
Yeah, it'd be good to have some examples of what the questioner means, but I think I know. I suspect it's in things that we feel we just don't feel we have the courage to stand up and oppose. I mean, one example to my mind would be the gay conversion therapy legislation in Victoria. I don't know if you're familiar with this, but effectively, it's on the surface, it's supposed to be legislation that stops, sort of forcible gay conversion therapy for people who are challenged by their own sexuality or something. I don't know, but and it harks back to sort of practices you associate with the sort of Bible Belt of America in the 1950s that, as far as I can see, don't go on here and haven't done, if at all, for many years. So, but what it does is to make really cement transgender rights, and in particular the right of minors to decide they're going to transition without any parental or adult influence other than the affirming doctor. So it's very dangerous legislation, and part of it makes prayer illegal. And you're not allowed, if you're a minister, you're not allowed to pray for a child who's confused about their own. It's horrible legislation, and yet the Liberal Party and Liberal opposition in Victoria just waved it through. And in some states, I think South Australia, they're even talking of the Liberal governments talk of introducing similar legislation. I think this is because we just don't. These are difficult things to stand out against, because if you do, people say, oh, you're anti, you're transphobic, or whatever you're supposed to be, and you people fear being marginalised like that, so they won't speak out. So we just have to show courage on those things, because otherwise we do end up adopting these bad policies. We've adopted any number of them, to be honest, over the years. Really bad ideas from the left that we've just sort of let through. But that comes back to doing the intellectual hard work and working out why they're wrong, so we can stand up with conviction and say they're wrong.
I know with that bill in Victoria specifically, I think Martin Niles was the one who said that if a parent said to their child who was gender confused, wait for getting gender surgery to change their gender, or even to say no, just to say wait, that could be potentially criminal.
Yeah.
You can face up to 10 years in prison. It's an extraordinary bill.
It is. Well, the whole modern transgender movement is an extraordinary movement. It's just built out of fiction. There's no empirical evidence backing what they do. Anyway, don't want to get sidetracked on that particular issue, but I encourage you to read there's some quite good books about it now, which explain why it is damaging, and I think it behoves us to be across that so that we know how to deal and help with people in that situation, people who are confused about their own gender identity.
If I can sort of not so much focus on that area, but we've got things like gay marriage, euthanasia, and abortion up until the moment of birth, and that 2019 bill allows the sale of those who are aborted for scientific research, stuff that you would expect to hear from a Soviet country, not from not from Australia. Come through the Liberal Party and have if they don't have majority support, they do have significant still have significant support in the party. Are these compatible with traditional Liberal Party values? And if what are they doing here?
Well, I'm tempted to say no, they're not compatible, but mindful of the fact that we have to be a broad party, a broad church. Then I'm not. I think they have to be. We have to say they're in a category of things that are matters of individual conscience. It puzzles me that somebody with, otherwise good Liberal credentials would vote for those bills, but good people do, even people I respect. So I think we just have to park them in a category of things which are conscience issues, but recognising the damage that we've done more broadly since the 1960s by abandoning the importance of the nuclear family, the stability of marriage, all those sort of things, and that's not something that been particularly partisan thing. It's been a cultural thing that dragged parties along with it, but the sort of social problems and issues that we've caused by trying to solve what we thought were social problems, like the stigma of divorce, for instance, are probably worse. I mean, sociology is my background, and I always wanted to believe that we could sort of create better societies and so forth. But I think experience has taught me that it's very, you can't engineer a better society, because they're people, not objects, and almost every attempt there's been to do that has gone horribly wrong.
As a follow-up question to that, do you feel then that some of the changes or reforms that people desire or want for the Liberal Party, do you think it more has to do with society at large? Do you think the reason the party is going down certain directions, choosing certain decisions, is because of what they feel the public want?
Yeah, I suppose to some extent, yes. It's. I mean, I suppose the gay marriage issue was informative, because it just seemed to me that the movement was on by the time we tried to have a serious debate about it. It was already, the momentum was there. I remember talking to Tim Wilson on that quite early. Well, it seemed to me quite early on in the discussion, and I said, "Well, look, surely surely the most obvious solution to this, Tim, is to ask, why is the government involved in marriage at all? I mean, government has a responsibility to, make legally binding civil contracts between couples who want to live together. But marriage surely is a matter we can leave for the church." So, the situation that, applies in a lot of European countries, for instance, France or Belgium, where if you want to get married, you have to go and do the civil contract, and then you go, to the town hall or whatever, and then you go and have the marrying in church. It seemed to me that was the kind of obvious solution to this, and would actually get us on a better footing, because I don't think it is up to the state to decide who should marry or not. That's a matter of, it's a spiritual matter to me. So, but Tim said to me, "Oh no, man, that's right." He said, that would be a great solution, but we're too far down the track now. Like, this gay marriage, people wouldn't accept that. They think that was a sellout. And I thought, well, by the time we got onto it, the argument was lost. So we have to, I think it comes back to what I said. We got to be thinking people who see these things coming, and are prepared to take, a courageous stance on principle, and actually argue these things before they get across the line, not try and push them back afterwards.
You mentioned there's a massive problem of attention span, both with those speaking and those listening. But for the 75th anniversary of the Forgotten People, you actually broadcast. It was one of the speeches over Macquarie Radio, and you noted in your essay that was one of your concerns. You were worried about the attention span.
Yeah.
Do you think, sort of, using that as an experiment? Do you think that there is, I suppose, a market out there for people, wanting longer form, discussions on ideas and principles that are fundamental to our country? Do you think there's a market out there?
Oh, there's definitely a market. And so Menzies tapped into the technology of his day. I mean, he was a leader technologically. Radio hadn't been around for that long, 1942. I mean, the ABC was only 10 years old in 1942, for instance. So, and people would sit at home and, they'd make a point of sitting around the radio set of the evening and listening. So they would listen. But I think that today the technology that really excites me, and we're using more and more, and I encourage you guys to not only listen but do take part in them yourselves, these podcasts. They are really exciting to my mind, and Jordan Peterson, for instance, does podcasts of anything up to 2.5 or 3 hours long, and he says, well, it doesn't matter how long you do them. If the quality of the arguments and the discussion is good enough, people will stay with it. They'll stop. And it's a great. I've always loved radio. I started in radio, and it's always been my favourite medium. So this is a kind of modern evolution of it. But the great thing about it is you're not demanding too much of people. It's even less demanding than the written word. You're not asking them to sit down, and you can have it on the background. I listen to, a lot of audio books now. In fact, I'd say I listen to more audio books than I read real books, because they're always there in the background, and you've got a spare half hour, you're doing something else and you can listen. So I'm finding they're working really well, and people will listen to the whole thing, whereas if we put it up on YouTube, typically you watch after 10, 12 minutes, 15 minutes, the audience drops off, because people you're demanding too much of people looking at a screen as well. So that's where we're going, and we're very consciously going that way at Menzies Research Centre. When we do YouTube's, it's very low production value, and we just basically stick up two talking heads, and a lot of people treat those as podcasts anyway. So I think podcasts are fantastic for us, for think tanks, and there's a whole conversation going on around the globe between conservative and centre-right thinkers, which I think is really enriching our thought in real time, and we'll see a lot of benefits from what you're doing now, actually. Similar thing.
Well, that's something I wanted to touch on next, and I suppose it's what would be your advice to young people, particularly students at university that find, the universities are quite woke, quite left-wing, and they may feel that they mightn't be able to express their views as much. What would be your advice?
I think the first thing is to think, well, why are you there, and do you want to be there? Do you have to be there? Or are you just going because it's an expected thing, because it's a prestige thing, because somebody said you had to go? I think we've been just and I think the answer for a lot of people would be, yes, I do have to be here. But I reckon if people ask hard about it, they go, well, do I really? We've just pushed far too many people into university, in my view, and not given them, or not highlighted other opportunities there are for people. So first of all, do you have to be in this hellish, wokish environment which you guys live now? But if you do have to be there, well, I think you have to find space to think for yourself and not be railroaded by whatever the line is in the lectures or the tutorials. You probably have to think for yourself privately a lot. I was fortunate we had really robust discussions when I was at university, but they were, of course, out in the open. It didn't matter. And read widely and seek out other information, like podcasts, like things like Prager University, and all these wonderful resources that are there, which will give you some really solid education. And Menzies Research Centre, I think we should be doing more of this too. We should be, just doing the basics of liberalism, really, history of liberalism and so forth. So that's what I'd say. Don't be cowed. Don't be, just remember you're smarter than your lecturers most of the time.
I can tell you, I'm not smarter than mine. If I can quickly ask, you've mentioned a few books and podcasts. Do you have any other books that you could recommend to us?
Heaps. One, if you really want to get serious, then this series by David Kemp. This is the last one. You're not familiar with this, but this is. So David Kemp has written a 4-volume history of Australian liberalism, and we underwrote this project, the Menzies Research Centre. We feel some ownership of it, but it is fantastic. So starting at 1788, and this one goes up to 1966. He's just working on the final volume now. But basically, in a nutshell, what he does is to show that the classical liberal ideas that thrived in Britain, Scotland in particular, in the 18th century, the ideas that emancipated the human race and set in train this great 2.5 centuries of progress, those liberal ideas were the foundation of Australia and remained pretty much the default position in Australia ever since, with some deviations. And so when Menzies in 44 revived liberalism, that was the idea. but to understand it in all its richness, and to understand it, as David talks about it, as a project. It's not an ideology, as I said. It's ongoing. It's never complete. It's always about, perfecting society in practical steps, bit by bit. It's not about throwing everything out and starting again. That if you a commitment to read that Kent book, and it's a big project, is very worthwhile, I think. Otherwise, the Forgotten People speech, if anybody wants, you can get it online, but we printed in a little booklet form, which we'd be happy to send out to as many people as want it, because I think that's a good place to start. And then just keep reading, really. The other book that's kind of crucial to modern conservative thought really is Hayek, The Road to Serfdom, which is Margaret Thatcher's favourite book. She used to give it away all the time. But that is a really worthwhile book, because what he illustrates you can see through reading that what the difference is between us and the socialists and Labour. That they like, and it applies very clearly to COVID, they like the central planning. We think central planning never works. It always ends up with poor solutions, and it's much better to allow spontaneity in a society. So those sort of works are really, if you're interested in that philosophy, they're really good works to get a grasp of.
Perfect. Thank you for those recommendations. I have just seen the time, and I am afraid that is all we have time for. I'd like to thank Nick Cater very much for coming on the show this evening. My pleasure.
No, my apologies. I should have said at the start, my apologies for missing last week, but I hope we've made up for that.
No, all good. It's been a fantastic discussion, and if people or students out there want to have more discussions like that, I do highly recommend you check out your local University Liberal Club. Join the party, get involved. This has been the Macquarie University Liberal Club. I've been your host, Rory O'Connor, my co-host, Andrew Crennan. Thank you so much, and see you next week.
Thanks, guys.